solve equations like this. Okay, our do the inverse general rule still applies. So what's the inverse? Well, squaring and square root are inverses of each other. So in this equation, x squared equals 64, the inverse of x squared is square root, and you need to do that to each side entirely. So the square root of x squared is x, and the square root of 64 is, here's where it gets complicated. Okay, obviously 8 is a solution, but is that the only number that when you plug it into x squared changes into 64? There's actually two solutions. So now we need to straighten out when do we only use the positive solution and when do we need to give two solutions. If you see a square root symbol pre-printed in a textbook or on an assignment or test, and it doesn't have any symbols out in front like plus or minus, this is called the principal square root. The principal square root is the positive solution only. So if it's pre-printed, you only give the positive solution. However, if you are supposed to take the square root yourself and it isn't pre-printed, you decide to put a square root into the problem. You need to give all the possibilities, and that could be 8 or negative 8. You can also write those two solutions this way. We call that the plus or minus symbol for obvious reasons. Okay, now let's try a couple more simple equations. This one has a square root in it already. The opposite of square root is squaring. So we're going to square this side of the equation, and we're going to square the other side of the equation. Square root and square cancel out. I have x. And the square of 17 is 289. We are done. All right. Now this is similar, but I have a cube root or third root of x. Well, the inverse of that is the third power. So raise both sides to the third power. Make sure you include the entire side in your parentheses. So this is x equals negative 6 times negative 6 times negative 6, which is negative 216, and that is the solution. Here's a couple more that are slightly more complicated. Now in this one you do not want to take the square root because you would have to take the square root of the entire side, and that's actually quite messy. But there's a better way. Simply get rid of the minus 11 first. We're isolating the squared term. So add 11 to both sides. Now what do we have? X squared equals 50. Now that x squared is by itself on this side, it will help to take the square root of both sides. So x is equal to, and this is plus or minus the square root of 50, and we can simplify it. Since 50 is equal to 25 times 2, you can take the square root of the 25, which is 5, and the 2 stays inside the radical. This is the exact answer, but simplified. And finally, the last problem. This has a square root. You cannot subtract 3 from both sides because 3 is inside the radical. So that's grouped together. Let's go ahead and square that whole side and square this. That becomes x plus 3 is 49. And simply solve for x. Okay, pretty easy, right? That'll get you started. You can solve a lot of equations knowing that much about how to find the inverse of squaring and square rooting.